Okay, we're at the point of the day where we're ready for our second keynote address. We're really pleased that Lucinda Cole is here to join us and to give an address. Lucinda Cole is the Research Associate Professor of English at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's the author of Imperfect Creatures, Vermin, Literatures, and the Sciences of Life, 1600 to 1740, from University of Michigan Press, 2016. Imperfect Creatures won the Robert Lowry Patent Award from Studies in English Literature, 1500 to 1900, for the best recent book in restoration and 18th century literature. Her articles have appeared in such venues as ELH, Criticism, Journal for Early Modern Cultural Studies, Configurations, and the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, and in collections on animals and animality from Oxford, Cambridge, and other presses. With Robert Markley, she's the general series editor of Anthropocene, a book series published by Penn State Press. She's now writing a book on food, empire, and zoonotic disease. She's currently going to give us a keynote address entitled Plagues, Poisons, Dead Rats, in Search of a Medical Posthumanities. Please join me in welcoming Lucinda Cole.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Bob. And those are not empty words. I know that these kinds of conferences are really a labor of love, and we, I think, feel the love. So thank you for that. And thank you all for being here, the remains of the remains. I mean, there are so many of you. I want to say just a word about Imperfect Creatures, the book that Sarah mentioned. The phrase imperfect creatures is taken from Aristotle, and he divides animals into categories according to degrees of perfection based on various kinds of things, including reproduction. And I've always found that it was still an active mode of division in the 18th century, and I found it very useful as a way of getting out of thinking about the human and animal in terms of a binary. So this book works through Michel Serres, Bruno Latour, actor network theory, and yes, Donna Haraway. And I examine vermin, by which I mean the category, as foundational to the creation of Enlightenment theological and political systems. And I think you'll see traces of that in this presentation, but mostly today I just wanted to think about the most ungrievable of animals, and that is rats. An issue of the British Medical Journal in the summer of 1908 contained an account of what the authors called enteritis, a severe intestinal order that struck 12 residents of an apartment building on July 18th. All of the afflicted residents had eaten in the same dining room, so at first health officials suspected a foodborne illness, but they were unable to locate a specific cause. Then on July 30th, they reported that, quote, a bad smell was noticed in a room quite close to the suspected dining room. They took the floor up and found 40 dead and decomposing mice, all lying alongside a hot water pipe, quote, where they had probably gone to get warmth on feeling ill, end quote. At that point, the physicians and health inspectors discovered that a rat poison called the Liverpool virus had been laid down on torn pieces of bread 2 days before the first human resident was stricken. In keeping with those of you who have sat with dead animals displayed in museums, rotting in the streets, or captured in art, I want to explore the material and symbolic afterlives of poisoned rodents. The Liverpool virus seems to be symptomatic of a complex fantasy structure based on the assumption that humans are physiologically distinct from the creatures with whom we share a natural and built environment. The rat poison was touted as a species-specific poison, affecting only, quote, rats, mice, and moles. This claim, of course, turned out to be false, as the 12 painfully afflicted humans attest. The fantasy that poisons can kill vermin and leave humans unscathed turns on the assumption that human health is distinct from rodent mortality. As we can see from the advertisement, the economic threat to food supplies is a crucial selling point for the Liverpool virus. Quote, "You cut away the gnawed loaf," the advertisement reads, "the candle, the butter, the nibbled biscuit, all of these exemplify waste, waste, and waste. Mice lighten your purse," reads the slogan to the right. In this respect, the Liverpool virus relies also on a techno-scientific assumption that these threatening creatures can be eradicated completely. The failure of this fantasy structure, physiological, economic, ecological, and techno-scientific, becomes visible or real only when they discovered the 40 decomposing bodies under the floor of a dining room shared by humans, food, viruses, rodents, and flies. Did I do that?
I think you did, but I'll go down a little bit.
Okay.
Is everyone hearing everything okay?
Oh, it's
yeah?
the tape.
Perfect.
Okay. Techno-modernity, as this conference has made apparent, is littered with animal remains, the dead bodies that we intentionally or unintentionally produce. Before moving on to tales of dead rats, I want to pose this question. Is there an alternative to fantasies that imagine the eradication of verminous animals only to discover the poisoned and poisonous bodies under the floor? One approach that I find intriguing in any case is the stated mission of the One Health movement, started by an international group of physicians, veterinarians, and environmentalists. Recognizing that only over 70% of diseases are vector-borne or zoonotic, capable of crossing species, this movement begins with the assumption that, and this is from the mission statement, that human health, including mental health, animal health, and ecosystem health are inextricably linked, and they seek to promote, improve, and defend the health of all species through interdisciplinary cooperation. Since 2000, the movement has produced a number of books crucial to animal studies with titles like Animals in the Shaping of Modern Medicine, One Health and Its Histories. One Health emphasizes that humans are fellow travelers with a wide range of sentient non-human creatures with whom we share an increasingly feverish world. Today, in the spirit of the One Health movement, I invite you to think with me about the place of rats, mostly dead ones, in our real and imaginary practices. My presentation proceeds chronologically from the 17th century, at the beginning of Europe's imperial efforts and at the height of bubonic plague, through the early 20th century when the source of the plague had been identified. Now, one version of this story is already familiar. Humans died en masse from a mysterious disease spread through global trade. After the development of germ theory, rodents and their fleas were demonized as disease vectors. This is not, or at least not entirely, the story that I want to tell. Instead, in keeping with the concerns of this conference, I want to focus on three key, usually fatal, multi-species relationships. Those between humans and rats, as exemplified in the literature of colonial expansion, including Daniel Defoe's 1719 Monument to Individualism, Robinson Crusoe. Those between cats and rats, as exemplified in 19th century shipboard travel literature. And those between rats and public health officials in early 20th century epidemiological literature. In brief, rats enter into medical histories in one of two ways, either as disease vectors or experimental subjects. In both cases, rats get scapegoated, one might say scape-ratted, by an anthropocentric medical and scientific modernity. But as I'll suggest at the conclusion of my talk, rats bring into focus the possibilities of what I call a medical posthumanities, as a cross-disciplinary supplement to both medical humanities focused almost exclusively on human health, and to the mainstream concerns of animal and environmental studies. The medical posthumanities perhaps could serve as a kind of prophylactic against the thinking that leads to newer, more dangerous, and more profitable versions of the Liverpool virus. So I want to start with the colonial fantasy. In 2011, the Nature Conservancy began a two-phase project to eradicate non-native animals that had been introduced in the 17th century to the Galapagos Islands and have been breeding ever since. After removing goats, cats, pigs, and burros, conservationists turned their attention to rats, whose population density had reportedly reached about 1 rat for every square foot on Pinzon, the main island, and what newspaper describes as the biggest raticide in the history of South America, Ecuador began dumping 22 tons of poison designed to kill 18 million rats, eliminating, if all goes to plan, the entire rat population by 2020. The ancestors of these doomed Galapagos rats traveled from Europe and colonial South America on trading vessels and pirate ships, and there is strong evidence that even in the early modern period, colonizing rats already posed a significant threat to imperial ventures. Rats destroyed harvested grain and devastated food systems, especially aboard ships and on islands. And European mercantile and colonial aspirations depended to a great extent on battling vermin to, at best, a standstill. Not surprisingly then, 17th and 18th century accounts dramatized these struggles by restaging the ravages of traditional plague literature as a series of biopolitical management crises. Robinson Crusoe deploys vermin in this manner to promote a colonialist fantasy of seemingly endless growth and infinite profitability. Defoe transforms rats and other vermin from the ubiquitous threats that slither and crawl through 17th century plague narratives, and I'm talking about bubonic plague, and travel writing to controllable populations, animal and human. Rats, birds, wolves, and hostile indigenes fall victim to the same violent technologies: traps, toxicants, repellents, barriers, and banishment. And the voyage narratives that Defoe drew on for Robinson Crusoe, rats run rampant. And William Dampier's accounts of his circumnavigations in the 1690s and early 1700s, rodents pose a dire threat to shipboard provisions. Leaving Cape Corrientes on the west coast of Mexico to sail across the Pacific to the East Indies, Dampier describes the crew's fear at having their meager provisions ravaged by shipboard rats. Quote, "We had not 60 days' provision, at a little more than half a pint of maize a day for each man, and we had a great many rats aboard, which we could not hinder from eating part of our maize." End quote. Dampier's fellow buccaneer, Woodes Rogers, preyed on Spanish shipping along the coasts of Peru and Chile in 1708 and 09, and found that even when he stole grain, it was quickly much damaged by the shipboard rats. So you have pirates and rats competing for the same food supply. After Rogers rescued the Scots sailor Alexander Selkirk, marooned for 3 years on the island of Juan Fernandez off the Chilean coast, he described the living conditions that Defoe fictionalized in Robinson Crusoe. Selkirk, according to Rogers, was, and this is this quote, "much pestered with cats and rats that had bred in great numbers from some of each species, which had got ashore from ships that put in there to wood and water. The rats gnawed his feet and clothes while asleep, which obliged him to cherish the cats with his goat's flesh, by which many of them became so tame that they would lie about him in hundreds, and soon delivered him from the rats." Now, Selkirk's term pestered is derived from pest, an alternate term for the bubonic plague, but here it's used in the general sense of pestilence. Before Selkirk semi-domesticates the cats as a kind of feline Swiss guard, rats, reproducing like the cats in great numbers, literally threaten to eat him alive. Richard Steele retells Selkirk's story, but in describing the rodent infestation, obscures the shipboard origins of both cats and rats. And this is Steele. "His habitation was extremely pestered with rats, which gnawed his clothes and feet with sleeping." To defend himself against them, he fed and tamed numbers of young kitlings who lay about his bed and preserved him from the enemy. Particularly for Steele, a patriotic Englishman, rats figure as the enemy and mark the dark, even verminous side of an emerging global economy. Transported to islands, vermin disrupt native ecologies and become integral and often threatening components of a new biopolitical order. The enduring popularity of Robinson Crusoe, it went through 1,000 editions and adaptations before World War I, depends on Defoe's narrative sleight of hand in banishing rats from Crusoe's island. The rats that plagued Selkirk devastated Rogers' pirated grain and continue to swarm 300 years later through the Galapagos are almost completely exiled from the novel. Defoe mentions rats only 3 times in Robinson Crusoe, all of them in relation to a single bag of corn. And those of you who have read the novel know this passage. Scavenging on his shipwrecked vessel for provisions, he finds a little remainder of European corn which had been laid by for some fowls which we brought to sea with us. But the fowls were killed. There had been some barley and wheat together, but to my great disappointment, I found afterwards that the rats had eaten or spoiled it all. So this bag of grain is chicken feed, the shipboard fowl intended as food for sailors on transoceanic vessels already have been eaten, or they perished in the shipwreck, or they've been killed by rats. Later, Crusoe discovers the bag of barley and wheat and then decides to take the nearly empty bag of corn that he supposed was, quote, all devoured with rats. Seeing nothing in the bag but husks and dust, he shakes it out. Once he returns to the island, a month later, miraculously, Crusoe sees a few stalks of something green shooting out of the ground. The providential preservation of grain against the threat of hungry rats leads to his meditation on the nature of this agricultural miracle. And he says, for it was really the work of providence, as to me, that should order or appoint that 10 or 12 grains of corn should remain unspoiled when the rats had destroyed all the rest, as if it had been dropped from heaven. As also that I should throw it out in that particular place, where it being in the shade of a high rock, it sprang up immediately, whereas if I had thrown it anywhere else at the time, it had been burnt up and destroyed. Because grain seeds quickly succumb to moisture, whether rain or rodent urine, Crusoe attributes the fact that a few seeds remain unspoiled to divine intervention, the work of providence in securing a suitable ecological niche for the seeds protected from the effects of the tropical sun, reaffirms the values and assumptions of a colonial food system. Strangely, however, the rats that help themselves to the poultry feed have disappeared. Unlike Selkirk, then, Crusoe is not pestered with rats. And the agricultural economy of his island depends, and I think this is an important point, not simply on the providential presence of European corn, that he just happened to find those 10 or 12 grains, but on the absence of rats that plagued European colonists who struggled to protect their grain supplies against rodent infestation. Now, given the 200-year history of rat infestations in European colonies, the erasure of rats on Crusoe's island is noteworthy, if not cognitively jarring, at least for those of us who are reading around that travel literature. The island's imagined environment is not an open, dynamic ecosystem, but a closed, zoomorphic world in which Crusoe hunts, gathers, farms, and stores under metaphysically secured conditions. This point is critical to understanding the ways in which rats figure in 18th century literature and its depictions of what we would now call ecology. Unable, apparently, to imagine a successful agricultural colony that accommodates vermin, Defoe banishes them from the island, a form of magical thinking not all that far removed from efforts on the part of the medieval Catholic Church to anathematize vermin by cursing them. And I think many of you know how those curses work. The 19th century, though, tended to confront vermin populations head-on, preoccupied by the extermination of rodents. I'll discuss two of the many practices to rid ships and storehouses of rats, cats, and poisons. This is part 2. I'm going to try to play this. Do you know this video?
Yeah.
Oh. I can't get enough of that. Yeah, sorry about that. So, although Crusoe's pristine, rodent-free agricultural colony is a convenient fiction, his depiction of a verminous cat population does seem historically accurate. According to biogeographer Sir Prochez, I think, there were, quote, no indigenous cats between the west coasts of Africa, the Americas, and Borneo and Japan in the early modern era. By the late 17th century, however, accounts began to appear of large-scale cat populations on Pacific islands. Given the devastating effects rats could have on shipboard provisions, sailors routinely brought cats on board ship to protect vulnerable food supplies. In his journals, Captain James Cook includes several comments on shipboard felines. My favorite, he describes a midshipman aboard the Resolution whose cat, quote, brought him the rats it caught. He gave the cat the forepart and he ate the back part, clean, roasted, and prepared. In this instance, the cat and human enter into the kind of symbiotic relationship typically reserved for the hunters and their dogs. Yet once introduced to the islands that were naturally feline-free, cats quickly multiplied into large feral colonies, and it is probably not an exaggeration that Selkirk was, quote, much pestered with cats that had bred in great numbers, or that Crusoe eventually has to, and I don't remember this, shoot them like vermin. Despite Cook's account of his midshipman's prized feline, cats were recognized as poor rat catchers. Reporting on the fate of England's first Bermuda colony, Samuel Clarke describes how the colonists, beleaguered by rats, quote, used all diligence for the destroying of them, including nourishing many cats, wild and tame, but to little avail. Within 2 years, though the rats flourished, many of the colonists had died. Describing Juan Fernandez Island in 1748, almost half a century after Robinson Crusoe, Commander George Anson reports that most of the island cats had been eaten by dogs. They were also dropped off. Of the cats reported in Selkirk's time, he claims there's scarce one alive. Rats, however, he says, keep possession of the islands. Noting these ecological realities, natural philosophers in the 18th century, like Oliver Goldsmith, admit that although the rat has natural enemies, quote, the generality of our cats neither care to attack it nor feed on it when killed. Reading through the literature, one gets the impression that in the 18th century, attempts to weaponize cats against rats were spectacularly unsuccessful, despite, the occasional poem about a cat. A history of unsuccessful campaigns resulted in the conclusion that the traditional shipboard cat was powerless against rodents. The Nautical Gazette of 1913 describes how most shipboard rats reproduce so rapidly that, quote, the ship's cat is quite unable to cope with the pests, no matter how enthusiastic or hardworking he may be, end quote. Despite the stereotype then, shipboard cats, at least in the medical and scientific literature, were far more likely to behave in the manner of the hapless video feline than to serve as a reliable check on rodent populations. Nevertheless, you can see that a lot of these, and I'll go back to these poisons later, that they all use the cat as a kind of reference. My favorite is the cat be unemployed. For this reason, rat catching cats frequently were supplemented by poison. Early husbandry and rat catching manuals often recommended Nux vomica, strychnine, found in China but developed by 17th century Germans as a rat poison. The rodenticide industry ratcheted up considerably after 1894 when the plague was identified as a rod-shaped bacterium called, after its discoverer, Yersinia pestis. By 1900, animals of all species were being exposed to or injected with the bacterium in the hopes of discovering which creatures, other than humans, could be carriers. And I do want to emphasize that rats were not identified immediately as the most obvious carriers. But one important study concluded that rats are more likely than most other animals to contract plague, quote, under natural conditions. That means, not being injected. And, quote, are of all animals the most important in the spread of this disease. 2 years later, an international German study ascertained first that the plague and its wanderings, this is a quotation, follows the routes of the great traffic and takes root in seaports, and two, because large number of rats infested seagoing vessels, rats are likely vectors. In response to the scientific recognition of rats as disease vectors, the Incorporated Society for the Destruction of Vermin was established in Britain in 1908. At the inaugural meeting of the society, founder Sir James Crichton Browne mentioned the following agents for vermin destruction: guns, traps, ferrets, terriers, poisons such as phosphorus and arsenic, and bacteriological preparations, such as Danis virus, which was probably the essential ingredient of the Liverpool virus. But the cat, as one contemporary noted, did not make the list. In the first decades of the 20th century, focus then shifted to ensuring that rats never left ships once they docked. In 1901, the United States Surgeon General adopted what became widespread measures to prevent outbreaks of rat-borne disease. Whenever any ship suspected of carrying plague or other contagious illness arrived to a U.S. port, it had to be moored away from the dock and anti-rat guards placed on cables and hawsers to prevent vermin from leaving the ship. Sick or dead rats were located and their diseases identified. If one carried plague, officials destroyed and cremated all the rats on the ship and then required that the ship be disinfected. The port in turn had to, quote, take measures against the possibility of shore rats on the quay making their way onto their ship. To eradicate rodents, fumigation became a regular practice, sometimes apparently over the objection of some stubborn ship captains. An article in 1914 volume of Public Health Report, shortly after the Surgeon General began to encourage the periodic fumigation of ships, includes this photograph of a couple dozen dead rats and one dead cat. They've been nailed up on the side of, some kind of building. The photograph had been sent in by the Surgeon General of New Orleans with a somewhat cryptic memorandum. It began, every quarantine officer, it begins, is familiar with the old plea of shipmasters that there is no use of fumigating the cabin of a vessel because there is a cat on board, which is an excellent ratter and renders it impossible for the rats to live in the cabin. But he says, he writes, the enclosed pictures are the result of not believing this story. The British steamship Ethelhilda arrived at this station from the west coast of Africa. The captain assured me that it was impossible for any rats to be in the cabin of the vessel because of the presence of an exceptionally good cat. The cabin was nevertheless fumigated. Through the irony of fate, the cat was forgotten. When the cabin was opened up, the enclosed picture showed the result. Every part of the ship had many rats. The picture is limited, however, to what was found in the cabin. 1 cat, 24 rats. End quote. Although the picture was intended to be humorous, a jab at opinionated ship captains, its humor nevertheless is instructive. The multi-species death shot is intended to be taken as a testament to the superiority of modern technoscientific practices over traditional ones. It is also indicative of a trend, a concerted effort to document the effectiveness of poisons as a way to contain, if not eliminate, infectious rats. By 1900, researchers from all over the world, Germany, China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Great Britain, began publishing elaborate tables of all the dead animal bodies collected from fumigated ships. And it had taken about a decade after the identification of plague bacteria for people to actually get the idea that fleas weren't commonly involved. So ships began being surveyed for fleas in 1903 with particular attention paid to Xenocilus tropus, now identified as the plague carrier. The records on fumigated ships during this period record thousands and thousands of exterminated animals. In this case, 18,265 rats, 7,866 fleas, and 742 mice recovered from 1,913 ships over a 2-year period. The Surgeon General describes the method. All arriving ships are treated with hydrocyanic acid, which is prussic acid, then search for dead rats, which were then bagged and brought to laboratories. The dead rats were searched for fleas and tested for plague. If the test came back negative, health officials compounded an emulsion from the livers and spleens of these dead rats, and just to be safe, injected that into healthy guinea pigs. The ex-fleas went through a series of baths, potassium hydroxide, alcohol, and then xylol, after which they were mounted in balsam and identified under the microscope according to breed type. A separate record is entered for each ship, we are told, giving the date for both rats and fleas. And let me show you one more. This is actually from Jonathan Burt's really great book on rats, part of that reaction series. This is flea counting in Bombay. The sheer volume of these studies, the thousands of rats and fleas bagged or mounted on a slide, indicates the extent to which contemporary public health regimes differed from those only 30 years earlier, when local societies like Crichton Brown's sprang up to combat port rats with dogs, ferrets, traps, and bacterial rodenticides. Karen Sayers argues convincingly that the empirical observations that grounded earlier methods of rat destruction, especially in agriculture, gave way in the 20th century to what she calls a new formal methodology grounded in capturing data, one shaped by an international knowledge exchange within non-agricultural fields, such as medical research and disease control, end quote. These studies, in ways that Robinson Crusoe would probably approve, attempted to determine under what temperatures and on which routes flea populations flourished or diminished. But given the by now global rat population, scientists at the time concluded that shipboard rat populations did not differ substantially by port of origin. I think that's kind of an important point. The only determination they could really make is that most rats don't like sugar. And so if you have a ship full of sugar, there will be fewer rats. The other single exception was the coast of West Africa. Instead of carrying grain, ships departing from these ports were loaded with nitrates, ores, iodine, cotton, and other non-food materials which are not attractive to rats. Increasingly and chillingly in retrospect, and I think you all know this, these studies also became preoccupied with the efficacy of fumigants, in most cases either hydrogen cyanide or Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide that was invented by German scientists in 1920. 2 decades later, it was the weapon of choice to exterminate over 1 million people in Nazi death camps. Technologies developed to kill rodents presumed to be diseased were used by the Nazis to kill humans degraded to the status of diseased rodents. What we see in both cases is the violence, we see a lot in both cases, but one of the things, is the violence of a sacrificial logic made possible on a mass scale by advances in the manufacturing and distribution of poisons. As René Girard argued in Violence and the Sacred, quote, all of our sacrificial victims, whether human or animal, that was my part, are invariably distinguished from non-sacrificable beings by one essential social characteristic. Between these victims and the community, a crucial social link is missing, so they can be exposed to violence without fear of reprisal. Their death does not automatically entail an act of vengeance. And then Derrida will pick up on this in his description of some animals as being non-vulnerable. I don't think he says a lot about rats, though. The sacrificed remains of the poisoned rodents instead serve as the basis of a violent technoscience with both ontological and ontological effects. Among them, the ridiculous change in the Animal Welfare Act of the United States, by which rodents bred for research were kicked out of the animal kingdom. Rodenticides in this techno-scientific regime promise that their mass violence can return islands to their rightful owners, whether Crusoean colonists or Galapagos turtles and seabirds. So this is my conclusion, such as it is. It's kind of a non-conclusion. I am hardly the first to discuss the foundational role of rats in modern science, a subject that has kept busy a small cottage industry. But I want to suggest that the failed Liverpool virus, Crusoe's magically exercised rats, the overmatched shipboard cats, and Zyklon B are linked in a network of material and symbolic associations that unite the past and the present, the ecological and the ecocidal. Repeatedly, in defense of human profits and health, we have deployed poisons to protect some perception, real or imaginary, of a pristine nature that may or may not have existed. The 20-year effort to rid the Galapagos Islands of introduced species, for example, including 180 million rats, was described by a specialist with the Nature Conservancy as, this is a quotation, an expensive but totally necessary war. And his word isn't a metaphor, since we have seen helicopters delivered rat poison in phase 1 of this largest ever extermination event. Phase 2 added less expensive drones, pictured here, and some of those were painted blue so they wouldn't scare the birds. These drones, according to Craig Morley, an invasive species specialist in New Zealand, have a chance to change how scientists view conservation work. And this is Craig Morley. You used to be able to see your opponent, he claims. Now you just press a button and fire a missile. The drones afford a kind of moral distancing. You become a little bit detached, he continues, from the reality that you have killed something or somebody over there. And this was published in Popular Mechanics for some reason. It was about the drone, that was what it was. Environmental news sources represented the poison itself as a kind of clean, targeted killing. An article in Mother Nature Network admires what it calls a, quote, special poison developed by Bell Labs that they say will, quote, dissolve after a week. This is still Mother Nature Network. Even the rats that ingest the poison won't be a danger to the environment, as the toxin contains a special substance that will cause the rodents' bodies to quickly dry up and decay, end quote. These news accounts make it seem as though modern science is finally able to accomplish what Defoe could render only in fictional form, rodent-free islands. But what really is this special poison? The Galapagos rat poison was a modified version of brodifacoum. In 1948, as some of you probably know, an anticoagulant called warfarin, which is related to Coumadin, developed to treat a cattle disease, was approved for use as a rat killer, sort of accidentally discovered that it could kill rats. It was marketed as a treatment for human heart disease 6 years later. At first, like the Liverpool virus, warfarin seemed a genuine improvement over arsenic and strychnine. Both of these old standbys killed rats immediately upon ingestion. This meant that there were all these rat carcasses around the bait trap, and these rat carcasses kept warned the other rats who were intelligent enough to know not to go there. Warfarin, in contrast, took effect only after a series of meals, which meant that these poison rats could wander for days bleeding internally, and so they often succumbed away from the bait station. Without a dead rat to signal danger, other members of the colony did not become what scientists call bait shy. Yet a different problem emerged with warfarin. Some rodents began to develop resistance, and they did this very, very early. So, at the request of the World Health Organization, Imperial Chemical Industries of London developed a second generation of anticoagulants that killed after a single feeding, causing rats to hemorrhage internally and then to bleed out. The chemical magic that allowed rodent bodies to quickly dry up and decay, as described in the Mother Nature's News, is probably a sodium chloride, which was and still is advertised misleadingly as depressing the thirst of a dying rat, and the promise is, well, the rat gets thirsty and it's going to go die outside. And the process of putrefaction is accelerated because it hasn't had anything to drink. More rapid decomposition means less exposure for other humans and animals to stinking and still edible bodies. But poisons of this class have a long half-life, which means they can endanger non-targeted wildlife who come along and eat the rat's dead or dying body. Aware of this probability, on the Galapagos, wildlife managers tried to trap and relocate native hogs and iguanas, a strategy that was largely successful in limiting the deaths of what pesticide companies call non-target animals. Yet, ecology nevertheless blended into ecocide. 29 chemical companies began mass marketing this poison, or some version of it. And the key here is that, it was what was originally conceived as a means of mass destruction, an especially violent and fatal tool of wildlife management, began to appear in agricultural supply companies and big box stores. The World Health Organization reported that brodifacoum was highly toxic for fish, and it caused abortion and hemorrhage in sheep and goats. In urban situations, where second-generation anticoagulants seemed an easy solution to a long-standing rat problem, reports began to come in of cat and dog poisoning, and even small children. Not surprisingly, raptors, who feed largely on rodents, began manifesting various stages of poisoning. And some of you may be familiar with the story of Pale Male, who was in New York, and there were his mates were poisoned. Since many of these raptors, such as the bald eagle, are protected species, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States tried to curtail commercial use, but guess what? It's kind of too late. They gave big box stores 3 years to sell their remaining stock. Loopholes, however, remained and still remain for farmers and exterminators using tamper-proof bait boxes. Worse yet, 3 of the 29 companies refused and continued selling to consumers. A 2015 report from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology reports that a whopping 86% of all birds brought into the Tufts Wildlife Clinic over a 4-year period tested positive for anticoagulant rodenticides. At this moment, No comprehensive policies exist to address the ecological effects of our chemical war against rats. Because it's expensive to test dead animals for evidence of rodenticide, few organizations even actually track the collateral damage. Some public health officials and environmental groups have suggested a return to warfarin and other first-generation poisons. Some grassroots campaigns have emerged from activist citizens who recommend returning to the breeding of raptors. This is a California group called RATS. That's an acronym for Raptors Are the Solution. Both solutions are partial, but they at least take seriously, as this conference has, the vital material and sometimes deadly existence of animal remains. Dead rats remind us of how many bodies lie in the wake of scientific progress and how naive it is to imagine a magic poison that can deliver humans from the complexities of multi-species life. I entitled this presentation "In Search of a Medical Post-Humanities" in order to signal the limitations of thinking about health in a way that eclipses our collective embeddedness in a multi-species world where one island's cure turns out to be another's poison. I called it "In Search of a Medical Post-Humanities," though, because I am not entirely sure where we go next. So thank you for giving me the chance to articulate this problem, and I look forward to your contributions and questions.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. That was amazing, brilliant. So we'll be taking some questions for the next couple of minutes, probably 10 minutes or so.
And then we can go have drinks.
Yeah. Would anyone like to kick us off? Oh, there's one question, Eva.
Yeah. Sorry, thank you so much. Sorry, this is a bit of an... I found an advert in one of my grandma's old newspapers for the Liverpool virus. And one of the things that it promised, and I ended up Googling it, and it was amazed that you were talking about it here. But like, one of the things it seemed to promise was really similar to this, in that it was saying that like the rat, it wouldn't affect humans, it would be just meat there. The rats get sick and they kind of go and don't hide beneath floorboards and smell and things like this. And so it's this kind of neat, it just promising this neat disentanglement, I suppose, from kind of human work like that.
That's amazing that you found that.
Yeah, like it was just this advert. And I suppose one of the things I was wondering was you said that certain people, certain animals are more affected by these, or can be affected by these things. And I know like with the Liverpool virus, it was particular forms of accommodation, as you said, like maybe poorer communities that were affected.
They never discovered the reason.
Right, okay.
With the Liverpool virus. They speculated that it could have been that flies went down on the bread. It could have been that there were mice, stepped on the bread and then walked across things. They just couldn't determine what it was. They just knew that it was somehow related to this poison.
Right. I just suppose I wondered if like particular communities are more vulnerable to being affected by. I don't know like whether rats appear in certain spaces and that might affect certain communities of people more than others, if that makes sense.
It does, and there's been a lot of work on, particularly in the Victorian period, in the United States, on rodents in urban areas, and I think that that was part of the big scare. This is kind of hard to talk about, but I'm sure that we're all at some level, thinking it, that rodents have also been associated with immigrants. And, that has consistently been the case. And one of the reasons I'm so nervous about the ease with which we are, killing these rodents is that I don't think we've actually dealt with the symbolic associations, and I just see them coming back over and over again. I mean, especially in the United States right now, Donald Trump and this administration, they have no qualms about using that language again, and it too is a language of affect. So I think there's a kind of dilemma, that especially when you're looking at issues of public health. How do we, and by we I mean animal studies people, how do we manage on the, the one hand the realities of public health without contributing to what is clearly, I mean, either ecocide or a kind of slow genocide? Because I feel, and I don't mean to be apocalyptic, but I have been in the United States, so I'm kind of feeling that way right now.
Yeah, Tom?
Thank you so much. Beautiful. I wonder if you could say something more about the figure of the island in your presentation, both Robinson Crusoe and Galapagos, and how that relates to the idea of a clean, isolated, bounded death. And I guess I'm thinking with some of the recent work, or decades now of work on island studies, trying to undermine that notion of isolation and distance around the island laboratory.
You didn't do that. I mean, that is, you did not fall into that trap of, you kept emphasizing, that the island is an open system, and that it's not enough to try to buy time. We need to have more systemic change, and so I would not at all say that this is something that you fell into, but I think if you just look at the popularity of the rodenticides after these kills, there's a sense that oh yes, I too am a wildlife manager. I'll put this in my backyard and watch the squirrels die. I mean that there's a carelessness that I think comes with I don't know. I hate to generalize about the violence of our culture. Maybe it's just not being careful enough about the science. But it's there nonetheless. Did that answer your question?
Oh, sorry. Yes, question?
Yeah, sure, but
Yeah, of course.
so I was wondering to which extent you maybe might see some connection to a type of imperialist narrative here, where science basically is almost erasing traces of guilt, of colonization maybe even. Like, these rats would not have been there in a lot of places if we hadn't brought them, and so in a way we brought the rats and we brought so many other beings that then destroyed local ecosystems. And if I can demonstrate that science in some way is stronger than, say, or is a useful remedy to solve the problems I have created that way. I was wondering if you see sort of a neo-imperialist.
I do now. So yes, yes, I think that's true. I also think that science is one system among many, and that it's important, to recognize the foundational status of vermin not only in science, where they still don't even have the status of being an animal, at least if they're laboratory bred, but in ecological, theological systems, not all of them, but certainly in Christianity, where rodents are not part of Noah's Ark. They were never really part of the animal kingdom to begin with, so that's part of it too.
So in a way, it's re-embodying a certain colonialist attitude as well. So this is my land now. These are my rodents, my vermin that I kill with my new remedy. I mean, isn't it also like kind of a nationalist enterprise?
Oh, no question. There's no question. But it can't. Well, the island projects, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, those tend to be pretty international, don't they? At least they have international cooperation.
A lot of them, yeah.
Yeah. But there is a sense of, certainly there's a sense of nationalism in a lot of those late 19th, early 20th century societies for the destruction of vermin. That was very, very obvious. Yes.
Protecting our children.
Yes.
We were talking before about the 200,000 feral goats in the Galapagos Islands that have been systematically eradicated over, I think, 7 years. Those were all from, I think, Australian hunters, like snipers that came in and eradicated them that way. So
Yeah. Yeah.
There was another question, I think, from Jody, or was there someone else in this area that I missed? Yes, Jody?
Yeah, Chris, Jody.
Oh, that was
Okay.
really amazing, thanks. I have a really wicked question. So this is not to deny the racism and xenophobia of your president in any way. But have you ever thought that if the rat is being scapegoated as an animal, that rather than the rat being used as a alibi for racism against immigrants, that it could be the other way around?
And by the other way,
You know, by the other way around, I mean, who are the companies that own the rat poison? And how much does Trump want to cozy up to them? Because those are, right?
So that the political rhetoric is driving.
It's a thought. I mean, because he's even wickeder than you think.
Oh, I don't know, Jody, we'll have to talk, but,
We'll talk.
you know, but, yeah, I mean, I do see a
There is a
certain.
way in which, right, the whole, yeah.
I mean,
There's a
there's a
market.
complicity, and one of the reasons I focus on Robinson Crusoe is that, you know, people from, you know, Rousseau forward looked at Robinson Crusoe as being the model of Homo economicus, you know, the economic man. And so I think that there is an economic logic that's operative there that has, you know, that has rats, or the absence of rats at its foundation. So there's that piece, and there's also the piece of, you know, the imperialism of agriculture, or at least, you know, efforts on the part of Europeans to establish European agricultural economies everywhere they went. And so, you know, that's a piece too. And I think my frustration as an animal studies person is that it feels as though we have to work on all those pieces, you know, simultaneously.
I had a question, if I might, ask about that chart that you showed us with all the table of like the dead rats. I was wondering, how often do you come across these kinds of visualizations of dead animal metrics? Do dead animal metrics come up a lot in the research that you're doing?
Yes, because most of my research these days is on zoonotic disease, and there are records kept, you know, back to I go back to the 16th century. So yes.
Yeah, so there's a way in which I think in all the papers that I've kind of been listening to that animal remains are kind of slippery, they're absent, they're spectral. But then here we also kind of see that there's this meticulous record keeping also happening in some ways, and I think that's really fascinating. Yeah. Anyway, other questions? Yes, Jane?
I don't know if it's exactly a question, but thank you. I really enjoyed that. And it made me realize again, I'd sort of forgotten because she survived, but my dog Mama ate rat poison in the neighbor's yard, and we saw her do it, and I had to call the big box store and talk to the clerk to say, go read which kind of rat poison it is. So when we went to the vet, sometimes are treatable with vitamin C, sometimes are not, and luckily she had the one. So there was the whole big box there, and it was
Vitamin K, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
it very much hit home, and she survived. So we were lucky with that. But there's something I wonder if you could think about back to Tom's yesterday, and the island, the notion of the island, the fantasy of the island as the pure and the laboratory, as if there is no movement of species that is pre-colonial, because there's so much movement in the Pacific before then. So I'm interested in this, you know, this periodicity of who counts as an invasive species. And this sort of relates to earlier work I did in cultural tourism on Hawaii, about where that line is. Where's the pure before?
Yeah, where's the nature before culture?
Yes, you know, the cats in Australia.
I think that's where Bruno Latour has been really important for me, especially We've Never Been Modern, because, you know, he, I keep seeing over and over again these gestures of purification and translation, and, you know, our attempt to distinguish ourselves from some kind of atavistic before, and so I don't know where that line is. All I know is that so far I have yet to find it.
Sorry if I may just comment on that, but I think there's a very big difference between species that do that themselves and humans actually actively bringing them, like goats or like cattle, to colonize the land of other people.
No question.
Destroy that entirely. So,
Yes, exactly.
But, well, I mean, this is a subject that I don't know that much about, so I hesitate to say, I'll just gesture toward it, that Europeans are not the only ones who moved animals and seeds to land, but clearly, that is in no way to undermine, the imperial and colonial effects of what we have done.
Yes.
So a number of my students have rats as pets, and they've introduced me to the whole sort of rat fancier phenomenon, and even the publication. And I wonder if it's like a big enough population, or if it's something that you've come across in your research that could serve as a counter narrative to what you've. That's obviously the dominant narrative, but.
What I know about rat fancy, I learned mostly from Steve Baker in his article that I read, but, that sort of, that particular group. But I have done a lot of research on tickling rats, and I wrote an article on rats who are tickled, and so I think that in some ways, it's an ambivalent counter narrative, because I'm not sure how I feel about going around and tickling other, species in order to discover if they're like humans. I mean, that's kind of uncomfortable.
Right.
But I know many people would regard it as a counter narrative. And yes, the rat fanciers, I mean, who was I speaking to who had rats?
Me.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, it would be, if I don't know if I want to go there, because it's just like a rabbit hole and I could get lost. But I think it does provide a counter narrative.
I think, Bob,
Have we got time?
we have time for one more question, so yeah.
Could you say more about the medical posthumanities idea, and how, Sheffield has a medical humanities centre. I was just looking at it, how it describes itself. It's got what it means to be human in there that makes one's heart sink every time you see it. I just wondered if you had more reflections on how animal studies might intervene in that the academicization of thinking about medicine.
Well, I think I can. I mean, there's a complex answer. The most straightforward one is that we can get ourselves lined up as Jane Desmond is with veterinary schools and things like that. I think medical schools, I mean, that is human health schools. They're going to be much more resistant, but in my experience, if you take seriously the science, then you're in a much better position to have cross-disciplinary conversations in effect than if you come at them with our by now very sophisticated 25 years of theory, including affect theory. I think that they would deeply benefit from what we're doing, but it's a matter of finding how to make that apparent. And one of the reasons I'm so thrilled with the One Health movement is that it's already started. And so, we don't have to start from scratch. Anybody who's interested in anything that resembles what's called, the medical posthumanities might, follow that up. And most of them are in the UK.
That's great. Okay, please, thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
Something new.
Okay, nobody leaves yet, please stay. We just have a couple of little things just to kind of follow up on the end of the conference. Can I ask that John Miller and Alistair Cochran and Bob Mackay can come up here briefly, please? We just wanted to offer a couple of little words that tie together some of the conversations that have been happening across the conference. And I think one of them is that animal remains is ubiquitous. It kind of appeared in so many different ways, and for so long I thought I was all alone in my really strange, weird, morbid fascination with animal remains, but then all of you had this, you responded to this call for papers, and it's been such a robust and intellectually stimulating set of conversations over the past 2 days. I think animal remains assert themselves in their absence. They create infrastructures. They feed into our value systems. They help us understand what we think of as capital. They establish collectivities like the whale fall, and they carry history into the future in some ways. They help us also to understand geological histories and our understanding of human-animal relationships across deep time through the fossil. And they also invite ways of understanding things like extinction, things that are happening on a massive scale. And they can also be a locus of human-animal relationships through things like bereavement and that sort of thing. So I wanted to give Bob and Alistair and John an opportunity to also kind of weigh in on things that we've been talking about over the past 2 days that specifically relate to the Animal Studies Research Center.
John, you
I'm not prepared anything at all. Has anyone, either of you prepared anything? So we are here, ShARC, on a mission that has failed to be as interdisciplinary as we wanted it to be, really. So this conference is great in that it has enriched what has been in some senses quite a narrow focus for ShARC. So we're politics and we're English literary studies, so we're kind of focused on, I suppose, we often think of it as different forms of representation, textual representation, political representation. So I think what this conference helps us to do is to enrich our sense of where we're positioned within the kind of crazy parochial university world of disciplines, and I think that's been a fantastic thing that has happened through this. Yeah. And one of the things that I really like is listening to people who speak and not knowing what discipline that they're in, and like trying to force myself not to try and work out whether this is like a literary person or a cultural studies person or a sociologist or a film person or whatever. So I think that's a good thing about the creaturely focus that brings us all together from the different silly disciplinary worlds we're all stuck to.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, in a way, just develop that point to say something slightly more, less intellectually rich, I think. It's just to say it's been wonderful to see so many new faces. We've had a number of conferences in Sheffield over the years, going right back to the year 2000, and quite often there's been lots of people that have been at all of those events, and this conference has brought a whole new group of people together to listen to and learn from, and that really is basically one of the main reasons I'm in the academic game, is that you get to listen to others and learn from them. And so I think that's been hugely stimulating, and that in part I'm just reiterating John's point about the range of disciplinary perspectives there. So we've taken up everything that could be said, so what have you got?
I'm just going to repeat what you both said, but no, just to reiterate what you said about thanking you all for coming to Sheffield and coming to visit ShARC. So ShARC, Sheffield Animal Studies Research Centre, I'm sure we've got aims and missions and a USP somewhere on a website or in a university document, but really the only aim is to talk about animals as much as we can and get away with, given all the other demands of university life. And I think we've been quite successful in doing that for the last few years, but particularly over the past couple of days. It's been absolutely fantastic because you all came. So thanks very much for coming. And please don't forget about us. So if you've got talks you want to give, if you've got collaborations you want to explore, if you've got fellowships you might like to be hosted here, we've got no money. But we do, We've got £200 a year. We've got £200 a year. But what we do have is tons and tons of people who are really interested in talking about animals and who are very happy to host and entertain you and so on. So thanks very much for coming, and come again. and tell your friends. So, but I think I want to thank Bob for organising so much of it, and also to Biosec for feeding me naked bars for the past couple of days, and for all of their support. But I think you've got one.
Yeah, well, I also, we have a little gift for Sarah. As people will know, Sarah's work looks a lot at fossils, and certainly Sarah has done more than most to explain and teach me about the liveliness and continuing presence and meaningfulness of fossils. So since Sarah's here on a 2-year postdoc as a member of ShARC, and I'm pretty confident that even after she leaves there will be a continuing meaningfulness and presence. So we've got you this ShARC fossil.
Oh my gosh!
I'm going to read what it says. Showing myself to be the animal studies scholar that I had a load of guilt about whether or not it was okay to buy a ShARC fossil, and spent ages. And I asked Tom Tyler, and he said it was okay. So, but I did make sure it was a British one, and I don't quite know why I thought that was good, but it certainly did seem slightly questionable buying like a Mexican one or something, or one that had been imported from somewhere. I don't think, as John and Alistair pointed out, that the ShARC knew it was British. Certainly, since it is a 130 million year old hybridonted shark fin spine from the Isle of Wight, England, Egertonodus basanus.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Alistair and John and Bob. It's actually really been a pleasure for me to be here. So for now, maybe we'll ask John and Alistair to have a seat again. Bob and I will just say a couple extra little things, just to kind of tidy things up from a logistical perspective. So yeah, I just want to echo again, just to say thank you to all of you for coming. I mean, this has been amazing. The conversations have been so intellectually robust. I've been really impressed. And actually, a lot of people have come up to me to say how such a high quality papers that have been presented. There's really been such wonderful conversations happening here. Just to let you know, there's going to be videos up of Lucinda's talk and Tom's talk, because they've been video recorded, as you may have noticed. We've also done podcast interviews with Tom and with Lucinda, and tomorrow we'll do one with Steve Baker. Those will also be up at the University of Sheffield Animal Studies Research Center website. So feel free to share those beyond our circles. They're going to be free and open access. We're also going to be putting together an edited collection based on this conference. So feel free, if you're interested in submitting something, please submit your conference paper to us in the next week or two. We'll send out a reminder and let you know about that. Tomorrow there's going to be the walk with Tom Van Doren. Is anyone coming to that who's here? Yeah? Okay, so that's going to be happening tomorrow. Definitely please come to that. I was also thinking if anyone wanted to come off to the Peak District afterwards, I was going to kind of lead a little group sort of informally to the Peak District, go to Bakewell, go to Chatsworth, pretty classically touristy kinds of things. But if that's kind of up your alley, we could meet out in front of HRI after the walk with Tom Van Doren and the lunch. So yes, thank you to all of you, and especially as well to our keynotes, Lucinda and Tom, and to our artist in residence, Steve Baker. I was wondering if the three of you wouldn't mind coming up. I just have a little gift for you. I don't know if there's space for all of us up here. But, so this is, what I'm giving them here is a poster of the Animal Remains Conference. So one for you. And I should mention that my sister actually made this. So she's an artist from Canada, and her name is Holland Bazan. Shout out to Holland Bazan. Thank you so much for making this such an incredible event with the artwork and with the two keynotes as well. Thank you so much.
Can I also briefly say personal thanks to Sarah for the amount of work she's put into this. We've been in touch for 5 months, so I'm sure that she's been working for longer than that to bring this together, and I think you've done a fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd also really like like to say a special word of thank you to Peter Sands and Christy, Oliver-Hobley, and Ming Panha. Can you please come up here, the three of you? So these three have been absolutely amazing at my beck and call for the last number of months, designing the program, designing a catalog, setting things up, answering emails. This really wouldn't have been possible without the three of you, so thank you so much. All right, so safe travels to all of you. We'll be in touch with you again soon. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, everyone.